Every year around this time, what with all the high school and college graduations, I get to thinking about my freshman year in college. And my most distinct memory of that first year is one of sheer terror, abject fear, absolute panic. I have never been afraid in all of my life. It was a strange new world I had entered. I was 1,400 miles from home, and the only person I knew was a junior who had been a friend of the family, but who I hadn't seen in years. But what so terrified me was not the newness and strangeness of the place, or the fact that I knew no one and was far from home. What terrified me were the classes and the professors. I'd been a pretty good student in high school, but I wasn't at all prepared for what I encountered on my first day of classes, particularly in my English class. The professor introduced himself, reviewed the course syllabus, informed us that we would be writing a paper a week, and then handed out the first assignment. And it read, and I still remember to this day, 60 years later, read Charles Dickens' Great Expectations and delineate the character of Pip using originality and creativity in thought and style. Then he added, your paper will be due in 3 days by this Friday. I gulped. My stomach rolled over once or twice, and fear and panic began to well up inside me. To begin with, I didn't even know what the word delineate meant. Nor had I ever had to read and analyze a book of that magnitude in just 3 days. Finally, in high school, you either wrote an original and creative paper or a serious analytical paper. I didn't know doing all of that together was even possible. Well, and it didn't help when I heard the guy seated across the aisle from me say, piece of cake, no sweat. I turned and saw him confidently swing a leg up over the desk in front of me. Then I panicked, really panicked, because I suddenly recognized what he was. I'd heard about them, but I'd never actually seen one until that moment. And there could be no doubt that he was, in fact, a preppy. He'd gone to a prep school. I could tell because he wasn't wearing any socks. And someone told him that's how you know a preppy is a prepper. They don't wear any socks. Not only that, they always wear beat-up loafers, never new loafers. Well, I knew I was a goner because everyone knew preppies knew everything, and everything was a piece of cake for them. So how could I compete with that? So I dragged my disconsolate self to my other classes, where the assignments were there seemed a little more reasonable, and I began to feel some hope, even though I saw more sockless, loafered, preppy wonders. I went back to my dorm and began to read and read and read. I completed my other assignments, even finished Great Expectations, then turned to the writing of the paper. And I looked up the word delineate in the dictionary and then sat down to get some things on paper. Except nothing would come. Not a single sentence. I looked up the word again, thought about the book, but I still couldn't write out any coherent thoughts. And the harder I tried, the less sense it made, and the more jumbled my thoughts became. I could feel the panic rise within me. I couldn't concentrate, didn't know what to do. So I took off my socks, and then I put on a pair of loafers. But that didn't help. The loafers were too new, and my feet felt very funny in shoes not wearing socks. Well, so I tried lying down, I tried standing up, I tried looking out the window, but nothing came. Finally, I took a long walk and managed to settle down enough to scratch out an unoriginal, uncreative, strained delineation of the character of Pip. I knew it wasn't very good, and when a week later I went over to the English department to pick up my graded paper, I wasn't surprised to see a big C written on the front. But I was still crushed. I was supposed to be this good student. So what was going wrong? And then depression joined my fear. So I sought out the friend of the family, the junior. "Oh, just relax," he said. "Happens to everybody. Everybody gets a C on their first English paper. And on the second one, you'll get a D. It's just their way of scaring you and making you take it seriously. Don't worry. You get a B on the third paper, and then you're on your way." Well, that was great comfort. And when I picked up my second paper and saw the D on it, I said, "All right, I'm on my way." But when I went to pick up my third paper, I really felt pretty good, because I knew what the grade would be. "Piece of cake," I said to myself as I sorted through the papers, found mine, and saw the B written on it. Except the B looked suspiciously like an F. As a matter of fact, the more I studied and turned it this way and that way, the more I realized that indeed it was an F. Failed it miserably, and something had gone wrong, very wrong. It was supposed to be a B. And I staggered out the door, wandered across the campus, stumbled up to my room, collapsed on my bed. What am I going to do, I thought, well, maybe I should run back home, join the circus, become a nun. I didn't know what I was going to do. What I did do was go and talk to the English professor, and he was a great help, and things became a little less terrifying. And I managed to make it all right in my other courses, and even get to final exams. But then suddenly the fear and panic returned and took on new dimensions. I studied and studied, but I couldn't retain anything. Nothing stayed in my head. And I knew what was going to happen. I wouldn't pass. I would blow those exams big time. So again, I sought out the wisdom and experience of the friend of the family. "Oh, relax," he said. "Happens to everybody. Everybody feels that way anyway. The solution is simple. You need a booking hat." "A what?" I said. "A booking hat," he said. "You know, a cap, a hat. Those things you wear in your head. Always wear a hat when you study for finals. It keeps the knowledge in. Can't seep out or float away." Well, made good sense to me. So I went out and bought a hat, a booking hat, and I wore it as I studied for my exams. And it worked. It did great. And over the course of the next 4 years, it became a ritual. When it came time to study for finals, I would take out my booking hat, put it on my head, and wear it as I studied. Didn't always work, but I was afraid not to wear it. After all, worked once. And this is my booking hat. It's 60 years old this fall. I still have it. And you know, sometimes I wonder if for many believers, religion isn't something like this, a booking hat. Something to wear when they become afraid. Something to put on to assure them that everything will be all right. Something to take out now and then when they are in over their heads. A magic hat. A ritual they hope will work. A ritual they go through because it worked once or twice before. And hey, they're afraid not to use it for fear everything will go wrong. And that's what religion actually became for the people of Israel at the time of Hosea. There was a crisis in the land and the people were afraid, filled with panic. So they had turned to other gods, they turned away from the one true God. But now Assyria was threatening them, threatening to destroy them. God was nowhere in sight. God was in hiding. So So they brought out their religion, put on faith, put on the old booking hat, wore the old ritual, believing that would bring God running to the rescue. And they were certain it would work, that God would come running as sure as the spring rains come and the sun rises every morning. All they had to do was just follow the ritual, say the words, go through the motions. But God knew his people well. God knew what they were up to. God knew that whenever a crisis hit, they dig up their religion and mouth the ritual. They would say, come, let us return to the Lord. His appearing is as sure as the dawn. He will come to us like showers, like the spring rains. But the minute the crisis passed, they'd be up to their old tricks again, bowing down to all the little gods of the land once more. They go back to looking out only for themselves and ignore justice, turn their backs on the hurting, do whatever they pleased. God knew them well. That's why he'd gone into hiding. It was God's way of trying to see if the people would finally seek him, truly seek him in faithfulness, and then at last they'd acknowledge their guilt and do his will. But the sadness of God is that he also knows that the people will not turn to him with steadfast and enduring love, that their love will be like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes away early. That all they want is for God to get them out of their latest mess so they can get back to doing the same old thing. They still haven't learned that what God desired was faithfulness, steadfast love for him and for others, mercy, compassion. God has sent prophet after prophet to lay it out, but they still didn't get it. That God required that they lived their faith. That's what God wanted. Not empty ritual, but faithfulness to his will. God hoped they'd finally figure it out, but they didn't. And 700 years later, they still hadn't figured it out. For 700 years, they had studied Hosea and hadn't learned a thing. So Jesus told the Pharisees, you'd better take another look at Hosea, because you still don't get it. There was another crisis in the land. Jews now lived in a hostile foreign environment. The Pharisees believed that Judaism was being threatened by the surrounding pagan culture and by forces within Judaism itself. They were afraid that Judaism would lose its distinctiveness, and Jews would gradually adopt the ways of Rome and cease to be God's holy people. The solution, the Pharisees believed, was to re-emphasize the religious law, especially the dietary laws, the Sabbath law. That's what gave them identity, and that's what they should give obedience to. But it was that was the object, to be righteous, to do right as specified by the law. But what was forgotten? What was forgotten was grace, mercy, compassion. What was forgotten was that the righteousness God commanded was that, mercy, justice. They had forgotten their own history of their own constant need for mercy and grace. Jesus hoped they would finally figure it out, learn what it meant to be God's people. But they didn't. And you have to wonder if after 2,000 years, had we learned? Do we get it? We too face a crisis in our land, it seems. So much seems out of control, violence constantly threatens, culture and value wars rage. Widening gap between rich and poor, and beneath the surface there's always that smoldering hostility between people. And justice is still hard to come by, except for a few. Much divides us. And God often seems nowhere in sight. God often seems to have gone into hiding. So you have to wonder, have we learned anything? Sometimes, it doesn't seem so. Like at the time of Hosea, and at the time of the Pharisees, vocal Christians and politicians cry out, come, let us return to the Lord. And it's hard not to agree that that's the answer. Returning to God, religious fundamentals, faith. And yet the religion that is called for often seems to be little more than a external. Like Hosea's people, believers dig out the old formulas, thinking that will bring God to the rescue. We need to put God back into this or that. That'll make the difference, it is said. Or put on religion and God. That will make everything right. And like the Pharisees, people feel threatened by a hostile culture and figure the answer is to emphasize the rules, legislate morality, identify the pure and the impure, so that God will be pleased and rescue us. Seems we still haven't learned. I mean, do you find it a little odd that in all the debates about culture and the issues that so divide us, Christians rarely, if ever, mention the Gospels or Jesus' call for mercy or compassion and reconciliation? Instead, what we always hear are Old Testament passages and selected phrases from Paul, taken out of context. And do you find it a little odd that while personal responsibility is called for, rarely, if ever, is there a call for social responsibility? And why is it that the poor are accused of being irresponsible, but rarely are corporations ever accused of being irresponsible? That's a little odd. And why are the ills of society always blamed on the unreligious and never the religious? Why do the religious think that God's judgment is meant for everyone except them? Maybe we too need to learn a thing or two still about what God requires. Could it be that the absence of God we often sense in our land is in fact God choosing to go into hiding so that we will finally learn? Could it be that the crisis in our land has as much to do with the faithlessness of the religious as it does with the faithlessness of the unreligious? You see, the thing we have to remember is that God's argument and Jesus' argument is not with the unreligious. It was with the religious, the very ones who claim to believe in God, those who should have known what was required. And what was required was faithfulness. The word Hosea and Jesus used for faithfulness means faithfulness to God's way. Faithfulness to the way of God's mercy and healing and reconciliation. Steadfast love for God and others. What is required is that worship lead to serving, that ritual lead to responsiveness to others, that the words of faith lead to the work of faith. Maybe what this land of ours needs more than anything is not for the religious to tell the unreligious what they should do, what is required, but for the religious to start doing what is required of themselves, to start doing compassion in a land that seems to have lost most of its compassion, to start doing healing in a land that can be so divided, to start doing justice, to start being people who allow their thoughts and words and actions to be formed by the gospel of Christ. Their wants shaped by God wants, and their feet and hands guided by God's love. That's what God, this land, this earth needs. For the religious to start being religious, start doing faithfulness. Oh, relax, the wise and experienced junior told me. What you need is a booking hat. But he was wrong. None of us need magical hats. What we need is to truly seek God's face, acknowledge God as Lord, and respond with steadfast love and faith. Amen.